The Bloody Appointment by Agatha Christie. Chapter 1. Do you not agree with me that she must be killed? The question lingered in the still night air, hanging there for a moment before fading into the darkness toward the Dead Sea. Hercule Poirot stood still for a moment, his hand on the window latch, then firmly closed it, frowning to keep out any harmful night air. Poirot had come to the conclusion that all outside air was best kept outside, and the air of that particular night was especially unhealthy. After drawing the curtains completely over the window and stepping toward his bed, he smiled to himself indulgently. Do you not agree with me that she must be killed? Curious words for someone like Hercule Poirot, the secret detective. It was intriguing that they reached his ears on his first night in Jerusalem. Wherever he went, something always reminded him of crime. He murmured to himself, still smiling as he recalled a story he had once heard about the novelist Anthony Trollope. Trollope was once traveling across the Atlantic Ocean and overheard two passengers discussing his latest novel. One of the men said, "Very good, but he must kill off that old woman." The novelist turned to them with a broad smile and said, "Gentlemen, I am most grateful to you. I will go and kill her at once." Hercule Poirot wondered about the appropriateness of the words that had reached his ears. A collective work, perhaps? A play? Or a book? He thought, still smiling. He might remember those words one day, and they might have a serious meaning. He reflected that there had been a tone of intense tension in the speaker's voice, something that carried a sharp, emotional burden. Poirot reminded himself as he turned off the light next to his bed, "I must know that voice." And the last words he remembered before falling asleep were, "That voice," and it says, "Do you not agree with me that she must be killed?" Raymond Boynton and Carol Boynton stood in the blue of the night, their companion leaning on the window ledge, their heads close together. Raymond repeated his previous words with tension. "Do you not agree with me that she must be killed?" Carol Boynton moved slightly and said in a deep, hoarse voice, "It's a terrible thing." "Not more terrible than this," she replied. "I suppose so," Raymond said violently. "The situation cannot continue like this. It cannot. We must do something. There is nothing else we can do," Carol said in an unconvinced voice. "If only we could escape somehow." His voice came hollow and desperate. "We can't. You know we can't, Carol." The girl shivered and said, "I know, Raymond. I know." He let out a short, sudden, bitter laugh and said, "People will think we're mad. We can't escape. Oh, what a mess." Carol shook her head. Raymond added, "I'm sure of it. Anyway, soon some people will say we're mad. Here we are, calmly and coldly planning to kill our mother." Carol said sharply, "She is not our mother." "No, that's true. She is not our mother." Silence fell for a moment. Then he said in a quiet, matter-of-fact voice, "Do you agree, Carol?" Carol answered firmly and resolutely, "I think she must die." "Yes." Then she suddenly burst out, "She's insane. I'm absolutely sure she's insane. She couldn't torment us like this if she weren't insane. For years we've been saying it's impossible for this to continue. Impossible for this to continue. But it has continued. We said she would die one day. But she hasn't died. I don't think she will ever die unless," Raymond said with steady determination, "unless we kill her." "Yes," she replied. She tightened her grip on the window ledge in front of her, and her brother continued speaking in a calm, resigned tone, with a slight tremor suggesting his deep, suppressed tension. "So one of us must do this, right?" There's Lennox too, but we can't push a child into this. Carol shivered. I pity the child. I'm very afraid. I know. And that's why something must be done quickly before she reaches the edge. Carol suddenly stood up, brushing her disheveled chestnut hair away from her forehead, and said, Raymond, don't you see that there's something wrong with this? Isn't there? He answered in the same disappointing tone. No, it's the only way to put an end to it. Carol murmured, but they will execute us. I mean, we can't explain how she was, how she treated us. Our words will sound fantastical, as if it's all the product of delusions. Only we know. Raymond said, No one will ever know. I've made a plan. I've thought of everything. We'll be safe, completely safe. Carol suddenly turned to him. Raymond, you seem different in some way. Something has happened to you. What has brought all this to your head? Why do you think something has happened to me? He asked, staring into the night. Perhaps because of that girl on the train. No, of course not. Why should that be the reason? Come on, Carol, don't talk nonsense. Let's get back to your plan. Are you sure it's a good plan? Yes, I think so. We'll have to wait for the right opportunity, of course. And if things go well, we'll be free. We'll all be free. Carol let out a small sigh and looked up at the stars. Then suddenly her body shook from head to toe in a sudden, overwhelming sob. Raymond, Carol, what's wrong? He asked. She, bursting into tears, said, How wonderful all this is. The night, the blue sky, the stars. If only we could be part of all that. If only we could be like other people instead of being in this state. Don't worry. We'll be fine once she dies. Are you sure it won't be too late? Won't we always be different? No. But I wonder, Carol, if only you... No, I'm with you. I'm with you without any doubt. Perhaps not for me, but for the others, especially for the child. We must save the child. Raymond was silent for a moment, then said, Then we'll go ahead with this. Yes, good. I'll tell you the plan. He bent his head close to hers and began to explain his plan. Chapter 2. Miss Sarah King, holder of a Bachelor of Medicine, stood in front of the table in the sitting room of the Solomon Hotel in Jerusalem, flipping through newspapers and magazines with disinterest, her brow furrowed, appearing preoccupied. The tall, middle-aged Frenchman who had entered the room watched her for a minute or two before stepping to the opposite side of the table. When their eyes met, Sarah made a small gesture and smiled, a smile that hinted at their previous acquaintance. She remembered that this man had helped her when traveling from Cairo, carrying one of her bags when she couldn't find a porter. After exchanging greetings, Doctor, Gerard said, I was about to order some coffee. Would you join me, Miss King? My name is Sarah King, she said as he took out an identification card. Please allow me. Sarah took it, and her eyes widened in surprise and delight. Oh, Doctor, Theodore Gerard. Oh, how pleased I am to meet you. I've read all your works, of course. Your views on schizophrenia are extremely interesting. Really? Dr. Gerard's eyebrows rose in curiosity. Sarah immediately explained, I'm on my way to becoming a doctor like you. I've just obtained my Bachelor of Medicine. Ah, I see. Dr. Gerard ordered coffee and sat in a corner of the room. The Frenchman's interest was not so much in Sarah's medical achievements as in her black hair that fell over her forehead and her beautifully shaped red lips. He was enjoying the look of admiration and obvious surprise she sent his way. He asked her, Are you staying here for long? A few days, no more. Really? As for me, I must return to Paris on the 14th. A group of people entered the room and sat down. Sarah watched them with some interest and lowered her voice as she said, "Those people who just came in, did you notice them on the train that night? They left Cairo at the same time we did." Dr. Gerard said, "They're Americans, aren't they?" "Yes, an American family. But they seem like a very strange family, don't you think?" "Strange? How so?" "Well, look at them, especially the old woman." Dr. Gerard looked and noticed first a tall, flabby man in his 30s, whose face was cheerful but pale, and whose manner was oddly indifferent. Then there were two younger ones, quite handsome. The boy seemed to have a Greek head. Dr. Gerard said to himself, "There's something about him too." Yes, it's a case of nervous tension, no doubt. The girl, clearly his sister, bore a strong resemblance to him. She too was in a state of excitement and tension. There was another, younger girl with red hair that seemed to halo her head. Her hands were tense, clutching a handkerchief and fidgeting with it in her lap. Another woman, young, quiet, with black hair and a calm but pale, angelic face, sat like a beautiful statue. And at the center of the group, God help us, he thought with disgust, was a monstrous woman, bloated and swollen, sitting motionless among them like a distorted statue or a huge spider at the center of a web. He said to Sarah, "What a mother, lacking in beauty, isn't she?" "She doesn't resemble them at all." Sarah asked, "And there's something sinister about her, don't you think?" Dr. Gerard agreed again, and this time his look was scrutinizing rather than enthusiastic. "I think she has a heart condition," he said. But Sarah dismissed the medical aspect, saying, "But there's something strange in their behavior, especially toward her." Dr. Gerard asked, "Who are they?" "Don't you know?" "The family name is Boynton. The mother, the married son, and his wife, a younger son, and two younger sisters." Dr. Gerard murmured, "The Boynton family. Yes, but there's something odd about the way they look at her. They don't talk to anyone else, and none of them can do anything unless the old lady allows it." Dr. Gerard thought, "They're strange, and she seems tyrannical." Sarah said, "She's a complete tyrant, I think." Then she added insistently, "And it goes beyond that. She's tamed them all. They're all at her beck and call, and that's inappropriate." Dr. Gerard agreed with sudden charm, nodding his head and saying, "Domination and tyranny are bad things." He cast a quick sidelong glance at Sarah as she watched the Boynton family, or rather, a specific member of it. Dr. Gerard smiled the understanding smile of a Frenchman. "Yes, that's the matter then," he murmured hesitantly. "You've spoken to them, haven't you?" "At least one of them. The young son." "Yes, on the train from Kantara. He was standing in the corridor and I spoke to him." Dr. Gerard asked, "What made you speak to him?" Sarah shrugged indifferently and said, "Why not? I often talk to fellow travelers. I'm interested in people, their actions, thoughts, and feelings." "So you put them under a microscope, so to speak?" "Well, you could call it that." "And what were your impressions of this case?" She hesitated, saying, "It was rather strange." To begin with, the boy blushed. I got the impression that he was, how shall I put it? He seemed afraid and embarrassed. And yet, an American boy, say in his 20s, would have more knowledge of the world and its affairs than an English boy of the same age. This boy must be in his 30s or 40s. Yes, you may be right, but his behavior seems younger. Perhaps there's a child inside him trying to get out. If I'm right, I mean, there's something very abnormal about him." Dr. Gerard shrugged, smiling slightly at her enthusiasm and interest, and said, "My dear young lady, who among us is 100% normal? But I agree with you that there is probably a case of some kind of nervous disorder. I'm sure it's because of that dreadful old woman." Dr. Gerard looked at her curiously and said, "You seem to hold a great grudge against her." "I do. She has a malevolent eye," she murmured, "and so do many mothers when their sons are captivated by young women." Sarah joined in impatiently and thought to herself, "All Frenchmen are the same, obsessed with women." Yet, of course, as a psychologist, she had to acknowledge that attraction to the opposite sex was always the hidden basis of most phenomena. Sarah's thoughts drifted with psychology, but she emerged from her reflections with a sudden movement. Raymond Boynton was crossing the room to the table in the middle of the sitting room. He picked up a magazine, and as he passed her seat on his way back to his place, she looked at him and said, "Have you been busy today visiting the tourist sites?" She chose her words randomly. Her real interest was to see how he would receive these words. Raymond almost stopped, blushed, and flinched like a nervous colt. His eyes turned apprehensively toward his family members. He murmured, "Oh, yes. Why not? Of course." And he hurried back to his family, as if spurred by a sudden movement. He took the magazine. The ugly woman took the magazine with her plump hand, but her eyes were on the boy's face as Dr. Gerard noticed. She murmured something, probably a word of thanks, inaudible, and moved her head very slightly. The doctor saw that she was now staring at Sarah. Her face was neutral, expressionless, and it was impossible to tell what was going through the woman's mind. Sarah looked at her watch and exclaimed in surprise, "Oh, it's later than I thought. Thank you very much, Doctor Gerard, for inviting me for coffee. I must go and write some letters now." He stood up and took her hand, saying, "We must meet again." "I hope so," Sarah said, and she left the room, passing in front of the Boynton family. Dr. Gerard noticed that Mrs. Boynton had turned her gaze toward her son's face. He saw the boy's eyes meet hers, and as Sarah passed by them, Raymond Boynton's eyes turned slightly, not toward Sarah, but away from her. It was a slow, involuntary movement, conveying the idea that the old Mrs. Boynton had warned him in some way. Sarah King noticed the boy's symptoms and his avoidance, and his movement made her somewhat uneasy. They had exchanged friendly conversations in the train carriage, comparing their impressions of Egypt. Sarah had described how a camel driver had asked her if she was English or American, and she had jokingly replied, "Chinese," and laughed at the man's complete confusion as he stared at her. She thought the boy was more like a pleasant, eager student. Perhaps there was something pitiable in his eagerness for her conversation. And now, for no reason, he had become shy and rude. Sarah said to herself in annoyance, "I won't bother with him anymore." Sarah was confident in herself and her beauty to a great extent, and she knew that she was quite attractive to the opposite sex, and that she was not the type to be ignored by anyone. Perhaps she had been a little too friendly with this boy, because for some mysterious reason, she had felt sorry for him. But now it was clear that he was just a rude, arrogant, and impudent American boy. Instead of writing the letters she had mentioned, Sarah King sat at the dressing table, brushing her hair back from her forehead, looking at herself in the mirror with her brown eyes, and contemplating her position in life. She had just gone through a difficult emotional crisis. A month ago, she had broken off her engagement to a young doctor who was 4 years ahead of her in his studies. They had been very attached to each other, but they were too similar in temperament, and quarrels and bickering were common between them. Sarah was very domineering in some ways, and she had not given up her quiet independence. Like many women with high spirits, she was convinced that she was a wonder of strength and often told herself that she wanted a man who could dominate her. But when she met men capable of dominating her, she did not like it at all. Breaking off the engagement had cost her a great deal of psychological pain and heartache, but her vision was clear enough to realize that mutual attraction was not a sufficient basis for building a lifetime of happiness. She consoled herself with an exciting trip around the world to help her forget before returning to start her work seriously. Sarah's thoughts returned from the past to the present, and then she thought again about that strange, rude little American. She had no doubt that the presence of his family was what made him behave in this strange way, but she felt a little annoyed with him nonetheless. Being under the thumb of one's family like that was truly ridiculous, especially for a man. And yet, she had a strange feeling. There was something strange about him. She suddenly said aloud, "That boy needs rescuing, and I will rescue him."